Good evening and happy 4th of July. It's Friday, June 30th, 2023, and we are about to go into a long holiday weekend, although Monday's not officially a holiday. I think a lot of people are taking it, but it has been my observation that the sentiment of happiness for the American Revolution is somewhat muted. That may be because of the economic hardships people are suffering, the war danger, or that there's been such an attempt in the United States to snuff out the actual true legacy of the American Revolution, why this was unique, and why, frankly, the Declaration of Independence, the fight for the Constitution, the fact that our republic defeated the British Empire at a time when it was thought to be impossible, with noble ideas about the relationship between man and God and government, led to actually the potential that we're seeing today, where you have a revolt among over 2/3 to 3/4 of the world's population against the British imperial system. Unfortunately, the United States has found itself lately on the wrong side. And just as an example of how insidious this is, I thought I would share with you something that happened a few days ago. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, was in the United States, and he was given a real working over by the State Department and the Vice President, Kamala Harris, among others, to try and split India from the BRICS nations and have India line up more with the Quad, with the U.S., with Japan, with Australia, with the idea for war against China. So poor Narendra Modi had to suffer through various meetings, and one of them with Tony Blinken was held in the Ben Franklin room. And let me read you what Blinken had to say. He said, "Prime Minister Modi, Evan and I are honored to welcome you to the State Department. You're here in the Benjamin Franklin room, named after America's very first diplomat. He signed our first treaty. He charted the Gulf Stream. He helped pioneer electricity. He gave us our ethos of self-governance, and virtually none of this did he do while sober." Now, think about this. This is our Secretary of State defaming one of the crucial founders of our republic, making jokes that are not even true, obviously, but it does explain why they could all be proponents of drug legalization and everything else. This is the Tony Blinken who says, after President Putin of Russia very effectively and successfully quelled the intended uprising orchestrated by Mr. Prigozhin, which clearly was at least supported, not stopped, by Western intelligence agencies, who said this, quote, "We've seen more cracks emerge in the Russian facade. We've seen this aggression against Ukraine become a strategic failure across the board. In fact, everything Putin has tried to accomplish, the opposite has happened." Really? Like what? He put down the coup, and his popularity went from 80% to 90%. The population, whatever complaints they may have had about Putin's initial opening of the special military operation, is fully unified behind him. Not one business leader, civilian leader, politician broke ranks to side with Prigozhin against the government of Russia, or against Shoigu, or against Gerasimov. And then Blinken goes on to say, quote, "Rather than test the loyalty and strength of government forces to crush the uprising, the Russian leader grabbed the first exit he was offered, a sign of weakness that might invite another attempt." No, weakness is when you have to use force and censorship and dictatorial methods to impose your point of view, as we see with the Biden administration. It is not a sign of weakness to be able to stop an armed insurrection, unlike January 6th, which was not that, but an actual armed insurrection non-violently in less than 24 hours after it began. That is a sign of strength. But unfortunately, this insane logic is being parroted everywhere to such an extreme that you have Obama's former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, saying things as absurd as Putin's response to this shows how weak he is. Therefore, we can call Russia's bluff with an invasion of Crimea. If Russia responds by launching a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, don't worry about it. It will just make the Ukrainians fight harder. That's a little bit like the woman in Harlem from the New York City Department of Emergency Management telling you that you can survive a nuclear war just by going inside, closing the windows, and listening to the radio, and don't come out until it says it's safe. And if you just happen to be outside when the blast hit, forget all those images of Hiroshima where people's skin was burned off and things like that. Just get inside, close the doors, and make sure to remove your outer garments and put them somewhere to avoid the radiation. So you have, unfortunately, a leadership of the United States that is totally delusional and therefore a great danger to themselves and the rest of the planet. They're not in reality. Now, one way of addressing this is to revive the true spirit of the actual American Revolution, of which every American should be proud. And we should resolve to continue that tradition, because the point in the Constitution of forming a more perfect union indicated that our founders did not believe they had attained perfection. There were many of them, in fact, a large number of them, who knew that slavery was a terrible problem, that it was contrary to the intent of our founding and was going to have to be dealt with. So they were aware that the Republic was not perfect, but it was a giant leap in the development of mankind and the question of human governance. And my friend and campaign historian, Bob Wesser, is here this evening to share with us some of the history that is not taught, largely not known, to better help us spend some time in study and reflection over this July 4th and prepare ourselves to rescue our republic, and by doing so, pull mankind back from the brink of potential annihilation. So, Bob, I'm really glad you could be here tonight and looking forward to hear what you have to say. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. And I'm going to start with a clip, very short clip of Lyndon LaRouche in October 1997. This was a seminar that was a private seminar among dignitaries, ambassadors, etc., in Washington, D.C. So here we go.
China is the last surviving power on this planet which is not disintegrating. Every other part of the world is disintegrating. Europe is disintegrating. The United States economy has been in collapse since, in fact, in physical terms, since 1970. That is, the per capita physical market basket standard of productivity. By that standard, the per capita income of the labor force has dropped to about 1/2 today of what it was in the late 1960s. China, on the other hand, has in recent years, over the course of the 1980s and during the 1990s, has had a contrary trend. China is the leading power of the world, the only one which has had an upward course in economic development in the recent period. Some years ago, my wife and I and others developed a policy for the situation, which I'll devote much of today's remarks too, and Helga also in her way. The next chart. What we've developed, and this, as you see, is a global policy. It's not just a question of a relationship between the United States and China. It's a change the entire world policy, in which the relationship between the United States and China can become the essential pivot and keystone for a global change, a much needed global change, to keep the world from collapsing into a new dark age in the coming years ahead. What we did and have revived is which I'll describe how that happened. We revived this kind of policy to say that we must have a Eurasian land bridge based on the development of transportation routes, and the corridors along which these transportation routes would lie would become development corridors. Because when you have transportation, power, and so forth moving through an area on trunk lines, then on either side of those trunk lines of power distribution, transportation, and so forth, you have the possibility of economical development of that area to a distance of 50 to 100 kilometers on either side of that route. A highly competitive potential for development with supporting infrastructure. What we propose to do is to take the vast wastelands, the undeveloped areas of Central Eurasia, and by crisscrossing them with a number of routes of development from Central Europe, from a Paris, Vienna, Berlin triangle, which is a concentration of machine tool potential in Europe, to move these development routes across Eurasia into the United States, into the Americas, into Africa, and thus create a global development program to turn this undeveloped area of Eurasia at last into an area of development and stability, including the less developed areas of China, and to bring the whole world together in one large-scale economic development program which can be the basis for the revival and prosperity of the world economy in the coming century. That's the policy. This and what it implies is the only hope for avoiding a collapse into barbarism on a world scale during the coming century. We must do it now.
So this is all very interesting, and maybe some people think it's a little bit quaint. You know, wow. Okay, and it's true. I mean, this is a generation ago. So over the last 25 years, if you look at the physical statistics of the development of China versus the United States, it's like, right? Forget it. We're down, they're up. But what LaRouche is asserting is that only an alliance between the United States and China is going to be the engine for the development of the world economy. Now, what I want to present is that this is not an accident, that that's where we are now in history. This has very deep roots, and that's what I want to review a little bit tonight. So let's see. Go to my slides here. Okay. So people that have followed what I have done on some of the history of the American Revolution and with Chris Sayer are familiar with some of this. We've talked a lot about Cusa, and we'll address that briefly. Leibniz's role in creating the conditions for the creation of the American Republic. Oh, look, there's a Chinese guy here. What? What's that? What's that about? Confucius? Very interesting. We'll get to that. So first of all, Cusa. Okay, so Cusa developed this incredible idea of, he actually was a founder of modern science, and the idea was I mean, he says it here, man is a god. Man is a little god. He's in the image of the creator. And everything unfolds in the universe, the human mind can participate in it. And I'm always somewhat loath to put these little quotes up because Cusa is a universal genius that transforms epistemology, the study of knowledge, the study of how the human mind can operate and discover the laws of the universe, the laws of God. And this we've reviewed before. People may remember this. I'll read this. This is from the Concordantia Catholica from 1434. There was a big fight in the church and different factions, and Cusa was trying to create a universal idea of how all of this could come, people could come together from a higher standpoint. So instead of misconcordantia, you could have concordantia. So what does he say in this document, among other things? He says, hence, since natural law is based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. For since all by nature are free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or a living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and consent of the subjects. Wow. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler who is their equal in power can only be constituted by the election and consent of the others, and law is also established by consent. Now, of course, if you look at the words of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And of course, in Cusa's mind, this is not rampant democracy. This is the individual developing his creative capacities in the image of the Creator. And that individual and a group of those individuals can therefore determine their own form of government. That's a complete revolution for mankind. This is 1434. Now, these are not talking points. Cusa was directly involved in trying to do this. And the problem was, in Europe at that point, you had the Venetian oligarchy, the Venetian Empire, all sorts of things going on, where all sorts of aristocratic, noble riffraff running around. And there was like nowhere to go where you could actually create this kind of a government. So Cusa was involved in a project with the man on the left there, Toscanelli, and they said, okay, well, we got to go somewhere else. Go west. We'll find, there's a new world there. And that is directly what resulted in the Columbus expedition, and then later the English colonizations of North America. And it was because they had this idea: we have to go somewhere where this form of government can take hold without the noble aristocratic riffraff, the King Charleses or the princes and this and that. And that's what occurred. Now, let's go to Leibniz. I'm going to move myself. So Leibniz basically revived, because Europe was plunged into horrible religious war in most of in the 17th century, 16th and 17th century. Leibniz came out of the conciliation of that, which was, of course, the Treaty of Westphalia, and that was a real breakthrough for mankind. How can we exactly what Cusa was trying to do with the Concordantia Catholica? How can we resolve these factional ideologies, which is really what they were, at a higher level, right? And Leibniz kind of picked up the ball on this, and you see what he says here. I really love this top quote here. He says, in addition to the general beauty and perfection of the works of God, we must recognize a certain perpetual and very free progress of the whole universe, such that it advances always to a still greater improvement. And he goes on in the last sentences, and hence progress never comes to an end. So it's unending. The universe is designed in a way where it's unending progress. Okay, and how does man participate in that? Through the creative discovery of science and technology. He said, I regard the arts and the sciences as a higher calling since through them the glory of God and the best interests of the whole human race are continuously promoted. In the sciences and the knowledge of nature and art, the wonders of God, his power, wisdom, and goodness are especially manifest. The arts and sciences are also the true treasury of the human race, through which art masters nature and civilized people are distinguished from barbarian ones. So this is the conception. The development of the individual creative mind can then participate in the development of human civilization according to the laws of the universe. Now, again, like Huza, these aren't talking points. This is not a guy sitting around writing little essays, right? Leibniz is deeply involved in trying to create and figure out how human civilization could move forward according to these principles. And one idea he has, which is extremely important, and this is the quote on the top. He says, I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human civil cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent. Okay, so remember, you have Eurasia. So on the one side, you have Western Europe. On the other side, you have the Orient. It is one landmass, right? Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as the most cultivated and distant people stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. Well, this is a beautiful idea. So now, I'll just say here, this is not some kind of wild theory, right? Leibniz spent the last decade of his life intensely studying Confucius and China and Chinese civilization and the development of it. That on the lower left there, you see that Novissima Sinica. That's a publication he put out. And the rough translation is News from China. You can subscribe. What's the latest news from China? And there'd be translations of Confucius. He wrote a whole document on the theology, what he called the national theology of the Chinese. And he was absolutely convinced that this extraordinary civilization had been way far advanced of anything else in the West, for 5,000 years. If linked up with the best traditions, which he represented, Kuza, et cetera, that this would be the future of the human race. There we go. Okay, again, he's involved in, Leibniz is not just a philosopher, he's an international political organizer. So he's involved in a project, which is the China project on the right, which you see. Russia, right? Leibniz goes to Russia, meets with Peter the Great. They establish the Russian Academy of Sciences. And for people that, you can look at the, on the website for the discussion that I did with Chris Sayer on this. But basically, he says to Peter, he says, listen, you have a job in history. You have to mediate the best of the Western ideas and civilization to the East. That's what Russia is. That's what it has to become. Right? He's very explicit about this, by the way. And then, of course, he's continuing the Kuzin project of the development of this kind of society in the New World. So he's directly involved in a battle inside England to make sure that the colonies in North America can develop that form of society. Oh, here we go. So on the right there, if you go down to Chinatown at Confucius Plaza, you can see this beautiful statue of Confucius. And I want to take a minute and I'm going to read this whole quote. And just, people listening, just think about what's being said here. This is from the Doctrine of the Mean, one of the Confucian classics. And he says, only the greatest truthfulness or pursuit of the truth under heaven makes possible the fulfillment of the individual's nature. The individual's ability to fulfill his nature thus allows him to fulfill the nature of other men. The individual's ability to fulfill the nature of other men allows him to fulfill the nature of physical things. Physical economy, for example. The individual's ability to fulfill the nature of physical things enables him to assist in the natural development and growth of heaven and earth, the universe. The individual's ability to assist in the natural development and growth of the heaven and earth thus enables him to act as one in collation with heaven and earth. Pretty remarkable, right? This is the reason that the perfection of pursuit of truth is unceasing. Unceasing, it endures, and enduring, it becomes evident. Being evident, it reaches far and wide. Reaching far and wide, it is of great substance. So this is one thing, one conception, right? The development of the individual, the development of heaven and earth, like one monad in Leibniz's term. Being of great substance, it is of the highest intelligence. It consequently contains all things. Being of the highest intelligence, it overspreads all things. Being of far-reaching endurance, it consequently accomplishes all things. Being of great substance, it is co-equal with the earth. Being of the highest intelligence, it's co-equal with heaven. Now, in Chinese philosophy, Tian, this is really kind of the idea of God or the universe. By enduring long, it is without bounds. All right, think of the Leibniz quote of the constantly development of the universe, the unending change of the universe. Its equals being such, it's clearly evident without being seen. It transforms without moving. It accomplishes much without effort. The path of heaven and earth can in one sentence be explained. It creates all things without duplication, and consequently, its creation of living things is immeasurable. The path of heaven and earth is extensive, substantial, lofty, intelligent. It's far-reaching. It endures long. The book of poetry says, yes, heaven's mandate, how profound it is and unceasing. So this is the perfection. This is Einstein, 500 years before Christ. Pretty remarkable. So now this is from another one of the great Confucian classics called Da Shui, or the Great Learning. And I'll just read this. The ancients, wanting to render intellectual virtue intelligible for all people under heaven, first had to govern their nations well. Okay, that's the first thing. Wanting their nations well governed, they first had to set their families in good order. Okay. Wanting their families set in good order, they first had to cultivate their own persons. Wanting their persons cultivated, they first had to make their hearts, emotions, upright. Wanting their hearts upright, they first had to have a pursuit of truth, of thought. Wanting to have truthfulness of thought, they first had to perfect their knowledge. And the perfection of knowledge lay in the investigation of physical things. This is fascinating. This is science, because that's what they're talking about. And there's a whole, we're going to be producing a video on Chinese civilization, which will go through this more thoroughly in terms of the history of the development of infrastructure, etc. Investigating physical things, their knowledge was thus perfected. Their knowledge perfected, they possessed truthfulness of thought. Possessing truthfulness of thought, their hearts were thus made upright. Their hearts upright, their persons were thus cultivated. Their persons cultivated, their families were thus in good order. And their families in good order, then their nations were thus well governed. Their nations well governed, all people under heaven thus lived in peace. And you say, well, so it's one conception. The development of the person, of the individual, the development of the family, the development of the human mind, the development of the nation. It's one idea. All right, so this is quite profound. And this is, now, you might say, well, that's nice, Bob, but, What's that got to do with the United States? Well, here's what it has to do with the United States. This is James Logan. He was the secretary to Penn, Quaker. He was the founder, along with Ben Franklin. He was like the mentor of Franklin, really. He set up the, you see on the lower right there is the library that he set up in the early part of the 18th century. And the idea here was to collect all of the greatest works in English predominantly, and also French, but of civilization. And this would be the repository of knowledge for the project of creating a new American republic. And he was completely on top of getting Confucius into this library. In fact, at one point, I think in the 1750s, he got really upset because he didn't have the latest Confucius translation. So he made sure he secured that. And then that on the right is a kind of a cartoon of Ben Franklin in his printing press. So as a young printer, allied with Logan and all of these others, this is 1737, the Pennsylvania Gazette. Okay, so I'm going down the street, 1737, I'm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Gazette, right? Okay, I'll have one of those, all right? So I grab one of those, and the first thing I'm reading is a continuation of the morals of Confucius. So Franklin was serializing the ideas of Confucius in his Pennsylvania Gazette. He's very young at this point. So, you know, if you're sitting there in Philadelphia in 1737, 1740, 1750, I mean, he continues this, right? You'd be reading about the ideas of Confucius. Well, that's interesting, right? And now this one I really love. This is a lot of fun. Okay, so this is a letter to George Whitefield. Who's George Whitefield? People may not know, right? George Whitefield is one of the founders of the evangelical movement, the Great Awakening in America. And these are fundamentalists, right? You know, your man's original sin, the whole thing. So they have this letter back and forth. What's the best way how do we get people out of sin? You know, blah, 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 blah. So here's what Franklin says. He says, well, you know, I'm glad to hear that you have frequent opportunities of preaching among the great. If you can gain them to a good and exemplary life, wonderful changes will follow in the manners of the lower ranks. On this principle, however, that's me, Confucius, the famous Eastern reformer, proceeded. When he saw his country sunk into vice and wickedness of all kinds triumphant, he applied himself first to the grandees, elite, and having by his doctrine won them to the cause of virtue, the commons followed in multitudes. Our more Western reformers began with the ignorant mob. When numbers of them were gained, interest in party views drew in the wise and the great. Where both methods can be used, reformers are, the Confucian method, are likely to be more speedy. Oh, that some method could be found to make them last. He that shall discover that will, in my opinion, deserve more 10,000 times than the inventor of longitude. So this is 1749. This is not 1776 or 1770 or whatever. There's Franklin saying to this guy, hey, dude, okay, if you go out and you recruit an elite, an intellectual elite like Confucius did, you know, and that's what you use as your leadership, then you're going to gain. I mean, that's the idea of a republic, right? Then you're going to gain people in droves. And of course, he's citing Confucius toward that idea, right? So, very important guy, John Bartram. John Bartram was the founder of American botany. He was a scientist in the kind of Leibnizian tradition. He was an ally of Linnaeus, Swedish botanist in Europe. He was a co-founder with Franklin of the American Philosophical Society. So he says, Confucius had been the greatest moral as well as practical philosopher that ever lived. Quite a statement. Plato, Aristotle, no. And he excelled Pythagoras in pursuit of religion and morals. His whole doctrine tended to restore human nature to its original dignity and that first purity and luster which it had received from heaven and which had been sullied and corrupt. He taught as a means to obtain this end to honor and fear the Lord of heaven, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to subdue irregular passions and inclinations, to listen to reason in all things, and to do or say nothing contrary to it. In short, Confucius was the original ultimate end of all things, and the one supreme holy, this is the word holy, intelligent and indivisible being. So I just think this is an absolutely remarkable quote. Now, one thing, I don't know how many people remember the autobiography of Confucius. I mean, of Ben Franklin. He was extremely focused on this idea of personal virtue, developing personal virtue as the basis of developing a republic. And he has and one of the ideas that he really honed in on was this Confucian idea of meritocracy, as opposed to progenitor or rule by inheritance or what have you. And he's having a debate with his daughter. That's who Sarah Bache is. And actually, it's about the Society of Cincinnati. He really was against, because it's like, it's hereditary. So he said, among the Chinese, the most ancient and from long experience, the wisest of nations, honor does not descend, but ascends. If a man from his learning, his wisdom, or his valor is promoted by the emperor to the rank of mandarin, his parents are immediately entitled to all the same ceremonies of respect from the people. So you could be like a poor, and this actually did happen in Chinese history. You could be a complete peasant, and in a year you were the emperor, and your family was promoted as such. Nothing to do with biological succession or anything else like that. On this supposition that it must have been owing to education, instruction, and good example afforded to him by his parents that he was rendered capable of serving the public. This ascending honor is therefore useful to the state, as it encourages parents to give their children a good and virtuous education. So you can see, he's taking the ideas of Confucius, the idea of meritocracy. Remember, this is the guy that absolutely insisted on universal public education. Well, where does that come from? Where is that? Where is that in Europe? Is that in England? Where do they have universal public education? Where? France? Russia? No, absolutely not. Nowhere. And this is a few more little tidbits here. Quotes from Adams, who says, all sober inquiries about after truth, ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, have declared that their happiness of man, as well as the dignity, consists in virtue. Confucius, Zoroaster, Socrates, Muhammad, not to mention authorities really sacred, have all agreed on this. And this has to be the basis of a form of government. But that's very interesting. You said, this is not just this is the United States based on Christianity or something. Paine is even more explicit, and you might imagine that he would be. As a book of morals, there are several parts of the New Testament that are good, but they are no other than that which had been preached in the East several hundred years before Christ was born. Confucius, the Chinese philosopher who lived 500 years before the time of Christ, says, acknowledge thy benefits by the turn of benefits, but never revenge injuries. And then I only have the James Madison thing here because apparently in his library he had this full-length portrait of Confucius. James Madison. What's that about, right? Okay, so there we are. July 4th, 1776. All of this comes into reality. Cusa, Confucius, Zoroaster, that's what the American Revolution was. It was a complete breakthrough that people had been fighting for centuries. And I want to just go through some more on this. But so you may say, well, okay, that's nice. And then, all right. But that maybe was just the founding fathers. No, this continued on in 1783. I don't even think the Treaty of Paris had been signed yet, ending the American Revolution. And a man named John Ledyard, who Ledyard, Connecticut is named after, and the financier of the American Revolution, Robert Morris, they had a great. This is the first thing they wanted to do. Is they wanted to have an expedition from Boston, to California, and then they wanted to explore further the Bering Straits. Ledyard had been on the Cook expedition in '76 that did the surveying of the Bering Strait. They're looking for the Northeast Passage, or Northwest Passage, to Asia, and then they were going to go to China and then come back. So this is now, the penny pinchers of the era were saying, no, we can't do that. We don't have enough money. Blah 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 blah. So instead, you get what a lot of Americans know: the Empress of China. Everybody talking the Empress of China, the first American ship and that was really a much reduced voyage of what was supposed to happen, although it was important, and it was led by one of actually Shaw, Major Samuel Shaw was the top aide de camp of what's his name, General Henry Knox, the artillery commander. So this perpetuates. In the beginning part of the 19th century, we have Christian missionaries, Americans, going into China, making alliances with anti-British Confucian. The guy in the center there was one of the top Confucian scholars in China at the time, who was part of the attempt to resist the British destruction, the century of the humiliation of China. The guy on the right there, Walter Lowry, who was the son of a leading anti-slavery abolitionist senator from Pennsylvania by the same name. He had a whole project to actually translate all of the Confucian works into English. He was murdered, probably by the British. So this continued. This is not something that just... And then, of course, you have the Opium Wars. We have the same enemy. And you see on the left, the British-backed Confederacy tried to rip the United States apart. On the right is a graphic from the Second Opium Wars, where the French and the British tried to, basically subjugate China. This is Lincoln's minister to China, Anson Burlingame, during the Civil War. He, after the war, decided that this country, it was an empire at that point, China, must be recognized as a sovereign country among the powers of the world. This is not a place that should be colonized by empires. And he, therefore, that's him in the center there. If you look at the top picture there with all those Chinese guys. So he was the minister, the ambassador of a mission that went to all the foreign capitals of the Western world and said, you have to acknowledge this treaty that China is a sovereign country. Now, this is really what I want to conclude with, because, he on the eve of him going on this mission, he presents a portrait of George Washington to Xu Jiyu, which is the guy that I showed before here in the center there, the Confucian, I call them the Confucian patriots, and he says, well, I'll just read this. Washington's life and character was such as to peculiarly commend him to your countrymen. Like them, he honored agriculture, and like them, he was for peace, and only fought in defense of his country. Like them, he believed that every man is entitled to the inspiration of fair opportunity. And like them, he held to the doctrine of Confucius, spoken 2,300 years ago. We should not do to others, but we are not that others should do to us. This great truth came to Washington not negatively, but positively from divinity itself. as a command unto him, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Why should we not exchange our thoughts? Why should we not have the moral maxims of Confucius and Mencius and the sublime doctrines of Christianity? Why should we not take our charming manners, your temperance, your habits of scholarship and high culture, and you, our modern sciences, our railroads, telegraphs, and steamboats? Why should not this great nation, the mother of inventions, whence comes paper, printing, porcelain, the compass, gunpowder, and the great doctrine of the people are the source of power? That's Confucius, Tian Xia Wei Gung. Some of the ideas that I quoted before. Follow up their inventions and principles and enjoy them in their development. So here we are, many, many years, 80 years after the American Revolution and Franklin and all that. And here's Lincoln's plenipotentiary to China about to lead an expedition, a mission to the powers, saying, hey, this is the basis upon which we should ally ourselves. Whoops. Now, this is the thumb I used for this presentation. So if I was in a class, I'd say, if everybody know where this is? Well, it's the U.S. Supreme Court building. It's the East Pediment, and there's a pediment up there, and it's called Justice, the Guardian of Liberty. You have Confucius, Solon of Athens, and Moses. And by the way, this was done as part during the FDR, early part of the FDR administration, 33, 34. That's when this building was actually built. So we'll end with this. And on the left, you have Lyndon LaRouche addressing a summit for China's peaceful unification sometime in the 1990s. Of course, LaRouche, at the age of 13, dove into Leibniz, really personally revived the Leibnizian tradition in the United States and the Western world, not to mention Benjamin Franklin. And on the right is Helga Zepp LaRouche, who did what? Well, she's from Trier, which is near where Cusa was born, and she revived Nicholas of Cusa's works and ideas. We even published a book on it for the Council of Florence. So there you have it. And of course, what does it say there? It says, the Silk Road Lady. That's what the Chinese, this is from a conference that she did in New York City in the 1990s. So there you have Cusa on the right, and Leibniz and Franklin on the left. And, that's the basis upon which we can revive this entire tradition, which is our tradition. The United States as the universal republic for all of mankind. And I have to end with this because a lot of this work was done by Dr. Wong. On the left there, he just wrote a book which came out a couple of years ago, which he's done a lot of the research in terms of the quotes and stuff, are from him. And for people that are interested, they can go to the website. He has Founding Fathers in China.blogspot.com. So that's it. Oops. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, thank you very much. First question that comes to my mind is, when did this shift? Is there a particular event, or because certainly no one studying American history today, well, first of all, they don't know American history, but second of all, they don't know anything about Confucius.
Yeah.
So what was the shift?
The death of Roosevelt. Death of Roosevelt was horrific. I mean, this is what LaRouche would always talk about. Because then came Truman, the police state, the McCarthy Gestapo, all of the top people that were involved in in working with China in terms of unifying the communists with the nationalists, et cetera, were purged. If you look at the Frank Capra documentaries, Why We Fight, there's a beautiful one on China, and they talk about Confucius and Confucius ideas. It's just like us, and that's in like 1942. All the GIs saw that, So, so the death of Roosevelt, because that was the last time when you had an American president, and I think Kennedy would have gone in that direction. People, he some of his advisors, I don't remember who went to him and said, look, because there was this horrible famine in China in the early 1960s, and they said, look, we should do something. We should help these people out. And he said, I really want to do this, but I got to get reelected. And if I'm helping the communists in China, I'm not going to win in 64, right? But he would have gone there too, ultimately. So the combination of the death of Roosevelt, the Cold War and the Truman stuff, and then the JFK assassination, and then, and that's, of course, who Lyndon LaRouche is. So he comes along and says, I'm going to revive this tradition, damn it. And of course, we all know how the establishment, the coupists or whatever, reacted to that. So anyway, I think that's the answer.
That's interesting. Well, what other thoughts do you have about the current situation?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is that, which is important to think about, is that we have a whole new generation of Americans coming up who really are not very interested in perpetuating the last 20 or 30 years, really, because it's like no future. That doesn't exist. And you have the same in China. You have very optimistic generation, young people in China who, see where the country is going, what they're doing in the world, what they're doing to lift other people out of poverty. And I think if we put this together, these two things together, we can revive this whole tradition with the leadership in the United States that represents it. I really think that's the answer. It's the younger people. It's the next generation. It's definitely not the boomers. They're all dying. It's okay. So. But because I'm involved with a project with people who are also in China and the United States, younger people, and we're producing a whole video on this to give Americans an idea of what China's about, because here you just can't find out. And one of the problems is, of course, the language. It's not like learning French, it's not like learning an Indo-European language. It's a little bit tricky. So a lot of the stuff that people can read, original sources that you would read from, if you were studying Germany or France, etc., most Americans can't. So we have to work very hard to bridge that. And I also think a lot more research should be done in this regard in terms of the roots of all this. And, Franklin, the founding fathers, and Confucius. There's probably a lot more there. So
I think now there are a growing number of people learning Chinese, partly for industry and manufacturing, but it is sort of obvious to many people that they're on a growth trajectory and we are not. So I know of people whose children are in some maybe more elite schools, private schools, who are teaching Chinese. But
yeah, and the other thing is, it really struck me once I started looking at all this stuff with Confucius and Franklin and and American Philosophical Society. If we can get Americans to see that we're supposed to be the cream of the crop. We're supposed to be the leaders in the development of these ideas. And I think that's in the DNA of most Americans, which is why we're getting a phenomenal response with your campaign, I think, is because people really want to be good, because our country was based on the idea of doing good, doing good for the individual, good for the world, etc. Make America good again. And so if we can give people a deeper sense of that's where we came from, and that's what we must perpetuate. That's kind of give people a complete. I mean, most people have a. I mean, I know growing up. I mean, we didn't. And I'm not a kid, you know, but so this is like 40 years ago. We didn't even read the Declaration of Independence. We didn't read the Constitution. That's crazy. So, and I think we, you know, if we give people a deeper sense of Americans, of who we are and who we're supposed to be in the world, that's really going to change things.
What would you say to people? We hear this all the time. Well, I have nothing against the Chinese people. It's just the CCP.
Well, see, this is just illiteracy. They don't know anything about what they're talking about. I mean, you know, in China, there's a leading intellectuals. They say, yeah, really, one guy calls it a Confucian republic, right? You know, and that's what we're going to address in the video that we're putting out, right? Is that you know, Xi Jinping has basically brought in the traditions of Confucius, the ancient classics, etc., you know, into the development of modern China. And so it's not really, you know, anyway, I don't want to get it's completely different than any kind of boogeyman idea that people have. It's a meritocracy. There's a democratic process through which you become the president. There is. It's just what the Chinese call, they call it vertical democracy. It's the meritocracy system. You achieve, you know, higher levels. You ascend, as Franklin was quoting Confucius, you know, given your talents. And
well, you're supposed to demonstrate some level of competence.
Oh, absolutely.
Something I wish we had here. It's
right. Yeah, we could revive that here. We've been completely. I mean, Joe Biden would be sweeping floors in the Capitol. I mean,
well, I think he'd be getting cared for well in some kind of senior citizens home.
Right.
Yeah, no, it just makes you see how much we've been robbed, because we don't. I mean, this is 500 years before Christ.
Right.
But you see this, in a way, obsession, which you saw with the ancient Greeks, with the Egyptians, and later Leibniz Kuza. What is the relationship between man and all of creation? Where do we fit in? What's our identity? What's our identity as human beings? And of course, the whole point about the founding of our republic is, if every human being has an equal, infinite potential, then what allows one person to quote unquote rule over another? Is that really what it is anyway, right? I wouldn't call it ruling in a sense. The consent of the governed is a totally different idea. This principle of the general welfare is really key. It's really crucial. And then the idea that the government is an instrument of actually fostering the development of man into greater and greater coherence with universal principles.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you see big time with Confucius. I mean, it's from they have going back to the Shang Dynasty. We're talking about like 2000 BC. The idea was the ruler has to uphold the mandate of heaven. How do you do that? And there's all of these traditions of infrastructure. The rivers are killing people. We have to build dams, right? So that's the whole tradition. You do good for the people therefore, it's this whole Confucius idea. It's one process. I mean, that is a revolutionary idea 500 years before Christ. And you could see why someone like Franklin, who committed his entire life to trying to create a republic that would function, would like grab on it and say, yeah, we have to figure this out. But yeah, that's exactly right.
Tremendous. Well, I'd like to thank you very much. Is there anything you want to say before we sign off? Parting thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, join the Diane Sayer campaign, because this is what our campaign's about. I mean, this is what we're doing. It's not just about, New York State for Senate. It's not just about the United States. It is about that, obviously. But it's about bringing the United States back into a leadership to do good for the world. And everybody that we're in touch with, whether it's people here in the U.S., people in the, who are involved in the peace movement, or the people that we're in touch with in Germany, and Sweden, Africa, and China, that's what we're doing. And the degree that which people see that as a public manifestation of what's really going on in the United States, that's how we're going to stop a drive to world war, in my view.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to also encourage everyone to join the campaign and donate to the campaign, which you can do at sareforsenate.com. I thank you all for being here. Please have a safe holiday and protect your mind and develop it over these coming days. So when we come out of this, we will be invigorated to uphold the principles of the founding of our republic, including the principles that Confucius may have been the first to elaborate.
Right. Great.